Okay, let's talk novellas. In the last 6 months, so since the beginning of 2022, I've read novellas that have stunned me with how emotionally invested I felt in such a short space of time. But equally, I've read some novellas that just were so frustrating with how little was given and how much more the plot, the characters, the relationships needed to be explored. So this got me wanting to try out some more novellas to see if I can get a feel for the authors or the styles or the genres that I think make a novella worth reading. So first things first, it's quite hard to narrow down page count because different books have different font sizes, have different page sizes, there's all sorts of different things that can make a book 150 pages and in another be 200 pages, you just don't know. Generally it's based on word count, but it's really hard to find out and really time consuming to find out how many words is in each novel. So what I've done is I've given myself a parameter of about 60 to 250 pages as my categorisation of a novella. Anything less than 60 pages, I think you could argue is a short story because you could put 4 of those together to make an anthology. So anything between 60 and 250 pages, I am counting as a novella. That's the parameters for the books I'm going to be talking about in this video. What can go wrong? I think for me the main issue that crops up in shorter books is that they can be too vague, skipping over details, and this leading to the reader not really caring about the point that's trying to be made, or not really caring about the characters, or not really caring about where the plot is going. I'm personally a fan of themes being subtle, so I don't want the author to be pushing something in my face and saying this is what I'm trying to say, but equally you need to be able to get the meaning from the text, and in such a short space of time the author needs to be very clever with words, very clever with plot line and how those themes are being put forward. If the author decides to go down a more forceful route, it can come across as almost like a lecture, and I think for many people that's a big turn off in reading, is when you feel like you're being lectured at rather than reading a story. So I don't want to badmouth any of the books that I've read necessarily. So what I'm going to do is talk more about the books that I liked, the reasons why I think I liked them in that size of a book, and then talk about some of the books that are on my TBR as well, rather than talking too much about books I didn't like, because sometimes I think a lot of it is about personal preference. Yeah, anyway. First theme that I think for me works really well in a novella is magical realism. Very specifically, I'm talking about the sort of magical realism where a seemingly normal scenario descends into somewhat of a fever dream. So examples of this for me are The Divorce by Cesar Era. This is a translated fiction. I think it's Brazilian. When I read this, I described it as being like lost in a beautiful wood. Like, you have no idea what's going on, but it's a really enjoyable journey. So you start with a very normal scenario. A man who's recently divorced he's gone on holiday. He sits down in a cafe and sees someone that he knows. And from there, it just descends into this absolute fever dream of a story where people are reminiscing about growing up together, but the memories seem to be so chaotic and magical, and, rooms that are that get smaller, that you're too big to fit in, and, all of these crazy things going on. I want to reread this one because I feel like I missed something, but I did love it. So that's the first one that I'm talking about. The next one is Sexing the Cherry by Jeanette Winterson. This one I read in June, so I have talked about this before on this channel. I read this because I loved Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit by Jeanette Winterson. This one is very much more like a fever dream, and it's more like a fever dream from the very beginning. I wasn't sure how I felt about it because it's so crazy. And then there's a moment in it near the end where something happens that makes sense of everything, basically everything that's happened before. And so I would like to reread this knowing that little twist that happens near the end, to see what else I can draw out of it now that I know. It's definitely the sort of book that you want to reread to get more out of, but this is so crazy. I don't know how else to describe it other than it's absolute madness. And then the third one is Tentacle by Rita Indiana, another translated fiction. This one, arguably, is not magical realism, and it doesn't start with anything that feels very normal at all. You are already in post-apocalyptic Santo Domingo, so it's not even like a reality, like a current reality-based story. It is sci-fi, fantasy, there's parallel timelines, like kind of time travel, but not time travel, but it is an absolute fever dream of a book. But again, I feel like it fits. It's one of those books where if someone were to explain to you all the different things that were going on in it, you'd think, how on earth can that possibly fit into such a small book without being too vague? But this author is so talented. It works so well. And I think because of the narrative style, it's a very angry book, but that's because of the subject matter that's being talked about, which is the destruction of the oceans. If this were any longer, I think it would become tedious. If, like, hearing that angry narrative would become too much if it were any longer. But as I say, the author does this amazing job of bringing all these different strands that seem like there's too much going on together and it all making complete sense by the end. It was fantastic. So the next thing that I think works in a novella form is psychological thrillers. So very reminiscent of the way that I feel about this descent into a fever dream, so from reality into something crazier. I think that when a thriller is exploring psychosis, or not even necessarily psychosis, but very normal psychological things, but that can become issues, things like paranoia, trauma, things where your mind plays tricks on you, but yeah, like, hard to describe, but yes, feel very normal, but then you start to realise that something is not what it seems, where it unfolds and we realise that it's about a descent into madness, or a realisation that our narrator is highly unreliable, but we didn't realise that at the beginning. So as we're sort of unfolding and getting into it, unfortunately, as I pick up the books, it is going to be somewhat of a spoiler if you didn't know that was what it was already about, because it's a descent. So, you know, the ones that I have read and loved, The Night of the Mannequins by Stephen Graham Jones. This is a YA one, but I loved it. And as I say, it had that right length for, we start with something that feels very real. We know it's a horror, we know something is happening where people are dying, but then as it unfolds and we start to realise that there's this broader theme of the fear of moving on. So it's the end of school for this group of friends, and they're all going to start going off into their own lives. Sorry, my hay fever is really playing up. They're all going to start going off into their own lives, you know, university or whatever. And it's about the fear of that. And yeah, like, it's really brilliant. I won't go into any more detail because I really don't want to ruin it. One I listened to last month on audio was The Torment of Rachel Ames by Jeff Gunhus. Gunhus? Never read anything by him before. And again, this starts as a very normal, it's like a thriller horror. So it starts as a very normal thriller horror where a woman is heading off. She's an author. She's heading off into like a secluded cabin to try and write her novel. She's suffering with writer's block. And then she meets some very weird characters and things don't seem quite right. And there's a weird door that's hidden behind a wall. And like, there's loads of like these things that start coming out. It's like, what is going on? And yeah, it's like this descent and an unraveling, and us as the audience starting to realise that our narrator is not as reliable as we thought she was. I will say though, trigger warning for child loss. That was very hard to listen to as a mother. That really messed me up. The next one I'm going to mention is My Sister the Serial Killer by Oyin Braithwaite. This one is very much about family dynamics and us trying to work out whether the sister is in fact a serial killer or whether it is as innocent as she is trying to make it sound. I think that one's perhaps the most subtle and less like the others where a real mystery is unfolding, but that one's brilliant. I did recently read her next one, which was The Baby Is Mine, which is part of the Reading Agency's Quick Reads selection. I didn't like this. It has the similar themes to these other ones where it's set in lockdown in Lagos. Yeah, Lagos. And a man is cheating. Well, he's been cheating on his partner and she kicks him out. So he has to go and live with the widow of his uncle, who has just had a baby that he's never met. But when he gets there, there is another woman there who was the the mistress of the uncle, and they're both claiming that this baby is theirs. Weird things happen, and the electricity keeps going out, so there's like it feels like a creepy setting because they're sort of stuck in this house, it's locked down, they can't get any DNA tests because of all the COVID that's going on, all of this stuff. So it's got all those things, but this is written by a woman, so I can't even say I didn't like how these women were represented by a man, but this felt like it was playing on the crazy woman trope in a way that felt uncomfortable to me. Obviously, we know that one of these women is lying, because the baby can only be one of theirs, but their actions, both of them are unsuitable mothers, frankly. Both of them are completely disturbed, but in such a short book, you can't really explore what's caused these women to behave the way they're behaving. They just come across as one-dimensional, crazy women. And I really didn't like that. Yeah, really, really just didn't like it for that reason. But it is that same, psychological thriller, descent into madness. My memory card ran out. So, the final one in the psychological thriller category that I want to talk about is The Glass Pearls by Emeric Pressburger. This is one that I have just recently finished reading. It is being republished as of 4th of August by Faber Books. It is a republication of a book that was originally published in 1966, and it follows a Nazi war criminal in his attempts to hide from the Nazi war criminal trials that were going on. He's fled Germany to the UK. It's sort of 20 years after the war. The psychological thriller element of it is his paranoia and his fear of the people who are trying to find him catching up with him. It's got an ever so slight feeling of stream of consciousness writing style, because you'll have a pretty normal narrative and then something will happen, he'll be captured, or suddenly these people will turn up to get him, and then you'll realise that that's actually just his paranoia and it's not really happened. So it can be a little bit jarring in that sense. I ended up really loving this. The whole way through, until about 75%, I was thinking, 3.5, I didn't love it, but it was very much a slow burn. By the end of it, I felt like it would be a 4-star read. And then when I read the afterword, which explained some things about the author and how that related to this story that he'd written, I thought, oh my god, I'm gonna have to give this 5 stars, because it was the way he'd written it based on who he was and his own experiences of the war was just incredible. I ultimately gave it 4 stars because based on the actual book, that was what I was going to give it at the end. As I say, very slow burn, this interweaving of paranoia until the sort of final culmination of what's going on. And yeah, I loved all the different things about human nature and the fact that we're following someone who should be so despicable because of the things, the medical experiments he was doing on people in the concentration camps, but then there's his explanations of how he was actually giving them a slightly better life and he was doing it for the betterment of science, but then he's just this really reserved character in the book. Those things of human nature and judging a character and not knowing who somebody is, and it was just a very subtle book that really grew on me as we went through it. And I really loved, there was a section, I can't remember what the exact quote is, but there was a section where it said how if he had gone to prison for his war crimes, he would already be out and free again, whereas he is still living a life of paranoia and on the run and unable to access his money because he's taken on this new identity. So it was a really powerful read, but very subtle, very slow burn, and it's only really at the end when I can't stop thinking about it that I realise how good it was. Let's move on to the next category that I think works as novellas. So Gothic stories. Many of the Gothic stories that I've read are quite long ones, like The Woman in White. I find them a bit overbearing. That Gothic writing style, it's quite poetic, it's got that classics way of writing that I do struggle with, the descriptive way of writing. And so for me, when they're too long, it just loses me completely. So a novella or a short story in that Gothic style is much, much better. So here are some that I have read. The Victorian Chaise Longue by Margarita Lasca. I lent this to my mum, so I don't have it with me, but it is a Persephone's edition like this one. They all look the same. And this one is an ill woman who is pretty much bedbound, and she wakes up one day. She goes to sit on her chaise longue, and she wakes up in a different time period, and she's unable to move off this chaise longue. Yeah, and it's about the story that's going on around her in this second timeline. So the ending is brilliant. It's just a really fantastic gothic story. The next one is Carmilla by J. Sheridan Le Fanu. So this is the vampire story that preceded Dracula by Bram Stoker. I personally think this is better than Dracula. Dracula, for me, started really strong. Loved it to begin with, and then it just got a bit boring to me. But yeah, Carmilla, perfect size to really give that gothic and that horror of vampires. Then we have The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Irving Washington. Washington Irving? Which way around? Anyway. So I love the story. However, there's like a racist comment that happens that I didn't like. I also, after reading it, realised how insanely sexist it is, because the women are either sluts or teasers, basically. But the reading experience of it was fun. The horror element, the gothic element was good. But yeah, it is a bit racist and very sexist. So, yes. So then we'll move on to experimental fiction. So I've recently started exploring the Goldsmith Prize. And I've done a recent reading vlog where I was reading Like a Mule Bringing Ice Cream to the Sun, which would have fallen into this, but I have instead decided just to talk about Mrs. Dalloway instead, because it's very much inspired by Mrs. Dalloway. But yeah, so experimental fiction is something that I didn't realise I particularly liked. But this year I have read Mrs. Dalloway and Animal Farm by George Orwell. Both of them, whilst they were difficult to read, they were not something that I would pick up for a good time. They are both books that have stuck with me, both books that I think about a lot and that I want to reread and read books that are inspired by them and read what people have to say about them, because they are interesting. And so experimental fiction is something that's going on this list, because if these were any longer, I don't think I could have coped. I think I would have absolutely lost my mind. So Mrs. Dalloway, many people don't like this because of the fact that it's stream of consciousness. I've read quite a few books now that have an element of stream of consciousness. So I was just talking about The Glass Pearls by Emeric Pressburger, which has a bit of it, Like a Mule Bringing Ice Cream to the Sun. That one was stream of consciousness, but it had like a softer feeling to it. This one is quite jarring to read because you're in somebody's thoughts and then they'll walk up to some traffic lights and suddenly you're jolted out of this reverie into something else. And equally, the different people's minds that you're in all have different thought styles. So you might have someone who has really rapid thoughts or much harder thoughts to understand, and then you'll have someone who's got much more relaxed thoughts. So it is a difficult read, and I can understand why people don't like it, but I personally really loved it. Animal Farm, which is all told from the perspective of the farm animals. It is political satire, talking about all the issues with capitalism and communism. I can understand again why people wouldn't just want to read this. I wouldn't want to just read this for a good time, but I'm glad I have read it, and I want to read books. So, for instance, Glory by Novella, I can't remember her now, what their last name is, that's been longlisted for the Booker Prize, which has this same political story based around an animal society. So it is interesting, but if it was any longer, couldn't have coped. Other ones that I'm putting on this list are The Metamorphoses by Franz Kafka. I listened to that on audio. I don't know if I recommend it on audio. I would like to read a physical copy of it. And then, of course, Ghost Wall by Sarah Moss. Not massively experimental, but I do feel like it fits on this. As I'm mentioning in my Women's Prize 2019 vlog, there are elements of this that I loved, but there are equally elements of this that I just didn't get on with. But yeah, And so then some that I couldn't tell you why I liked them. Unboxed by Non Pratt. So this is one of the ones that actually prompted this, because it is a YA story. It is about a group of teenagers whose friend has died of cancer, and they go back to dig up this time capsule that together they buried. And in such a short space of time, I was so emotionally invested. I don't cry at books, but this one had me welling up, had me really emotional despite how short it was, and despite the fact that it was YA. I have loved 3 of the books by H.G. Wells that are all novellas. The Time Machine, The Island of Dr. Moreau, and War of the Worlds. I thought they were brilliant. Swimming Home by Deborah Levy. This is, really hard to discuss why. I loved it so much. I read this one in June for Whatever-a-thon. It follows 2 couples who have gone to the south of France on holiday, and a guest turns up who... apparently it's supposed to be like she was supposed to be there the next week, and she got mixed up with her dates or something, but it turns out she's actually pretty obsessed with one of the men who's there, who's a poet, but it does look at suicidal thoughts and suicidal tendencies, and I really thought it was brilliant. We have On Chesil Beach by Ian McEwan. So this one looks at a woman who decides she doesn't like sex, but it's her wedding night, and the aftermath of what happens on that wedding night, basically, and how disgusted she is with the act of sex. Then we've got Kim Young, Born 1982 by Cho Nam-ju. This is a look at female oppression in Korea, but it read like a thriller. It was so good. Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit by Jeanette Winterson. This was one of my favourite books of 2021. This blends somewhat of a memoir. So when you hear Jeanette Winterson talking about this, she says she doesn't call it an autobiography because her version of events might not be what actually happened. So if you read the same set of events written by her mother or her father, they would be completely different. And then it blends in elements of Arthurian legend, and it's about growing up in a really religious community and realising that you're gay. Which brilliant. The Mermaid of Black Conch by Monique Roffey. Again, I listened to this on audio. I wish I had the physical though, because I think it would be better. And this one is about a mermaid that is fished out of the sea, and then a love story that ensues with her rescuer. But it explores ideas of communication and non-verbal communication, which I loved. Before and After by Andrew Shanahan. This is like a dystopian, no, not dystopian, but post-apocalyptic thriller story about a man who is supremely obese. Like, he is in the process of being removed. Like, they've had to remove a wall from his house to get him out to go and have a leg amputated, and then something happens that basically decimates the world, and he has to live and look after his dog. And of course it's like a enforced diet where he has to lose all this weight. I thought it was going to be just a bit of a comedy, a bit of a satire, but actually it was so good. It was one of the best books I've read this year. It had me laughing out loud. It had me literally holding my breath at certain points. It was amazing. We have The Mad Women's Ball by Victoria Mass, translated fiction. This is about the women's asylums in France in the 1800s. It has elements of magical realism, but it is really a look at how women were basically forced into going into these asylums when they were just unwanted, basically. We've got The Day of the Triffids, although I've just looked at the page count, and this is slightly over what I said, but John Wyndham is fast becoming one of my favourite authors. I've read his short story collection, I've read this, I've now got 2 more from him as well to read. I really, really love him. So this is dystopian, just really brilliant. I just love them all. P.D. James, The Children of Men. So this is another dystopian sci-fi type one where fertility has gone to 0, nobody's having new babies, and we're at a point where there is an ageing population and there's no one to really do all the work that needs to be done to maintain the infrastructure of electricity and all the stuff that we just take for granted these days. And then the final one is The Garden of Eden by Ernest Hemingway, which is somewhat of a classic. It was published posthumously, so he hadn't actually finished it. It was a completed novel, but he hadn't edited it and gone back and revised it. But that one was a look at questioning your gender at a time when the words and the communication around that wasn't there. So each of the books that I've just mentioned were phenomenal reads, but there is no reason why I think that they worked better as a novella compared to something else. So, for instance, many of the ones that I've listed on here are dystopian or post-apocalyptic, which I'm happy to read in whatever length they come. So it's not like the fact that it was a novella made it much better than it would have been in anything else. I do think the ones that I mentioned by H.G. Wells worked as novellas, because I think if they'd gone on too long I would have got a bit bored with the idea. Yeah, so it's really hard to describe for those ones why they worked as a novella and whether I would have liked them if they were longer or not. So then let's look at my TBR. I have quite a few, so I'm not going to go too much into them because this is already going to be really long. But we've got another Persephone books. We've got The Blank Wall by Elizabeth Sangze Holding, and this one is somewhat of a thriller. I don't know much about it. Rizzio by Denise Mina. I picked this one up after seeing it being recommended by Simon Savage from Savage Reads. Here we go. It's Saturday evening, 9th of March 1566, and Mary Queen of Scots is 6 months pregnant. She's hosting a supper party. Outside Edinburgh is bustling. It's full of the great and the good and the idiot sons of the rich, here for a parliament that will take Scotland by the shoulders and turn it from England to face Europe. Mary doesn't know that her palace is surrounded, that right now an army of men is creeping upstairs to her chamber. They're coming to murder David Rizzio, her friend and secretary, the handsome Italian man who is smiling across the table at her. Mary's husband wants it done in front of her, and he wants her to watch. Ooh. We've got Farzana and the Moon. When N meets the charismatic outsider called Farzana, he realises that something has been missing in his life. They fall for each other and begin an intense and passionate relationship. However, Farzana starts to isolate herself, becoming obsessed and embroiled in her mysterious connection with the moon. N is forced to reappraise everything he knows, searching for meaning and identity, while he violently collides with the limits of intimacy and love. Foe by J.M. Coetzee. Sometime in the second decade of the 18th century, one Susan Barton told Mr. Daniel Foe of her hard and unusual life, most particularly the span of time she spent cast away on an island with a man called Crusoe and his mutilated Negro servant Friday. This is the story of her story and how it fared in the hands of Foe, distorter of truth and inventor of histories. So I quite like these that take something and play on it. Anyway. Sterling Carat Gold by Isabel Weidner. This one is set in London. It's political. It is won. Did it win the Goldsmith Prize? Yeah, winner of the Goldsmith Prize 2021. So, I'm running out of battery. I've got two novellas in one. This is by David Vogel. We've got In the Sanatorium and Facing the Sea. And David Vogel is a writer who was imprisoned in Auschwitz, so quite interested to read his writing. Rude Word by Lynn Tillman. A young woman drifts through dimly lit bars and rented rooms, reporting from the erogenous zones of New York and Europe, encountering increasingly bizarre sexual situations. She turns her curious, comic and fierce eye onto the contemporary world of sex and desire. And then the final one I'll mention, because I am running out of battery, is Rest and Be Thankful by Emma Glass. What a beautiful cover. And this is about a nurse on a paediatric unit. On long, quiet shifts, she and her colleagues, clad in their different shades of blue, care for sick babies, handling their exquisitely frangible bodies, carefully calibrating the mysterious machines that keep them alive. Laura may be burned out. Her hands have been raw from washing as long as she can remember. When she sleeps, she dreams of water. When she wakes, she finds herself lying next to a man who doesn't love her anymore, and there is a strange figure dancing in the corner of her vision, always just beyond her reach. Yeah, so I've got quite a collection. I do have a whole other stack that I'll have to tell you about another time because I am running out of battery and time to film this. But thank you for watching. I'd love your recommendations for novellas, whether you liked any of the ones that I liked, and whether you have any categories that you think make a good novella. I'd love to hear your theories on it. So thanks for watching.